In this video, I'm going to be going over the poetry analysis practice that we did on Tuesday. The first question of this analysis was looking at setting in The Raven, and I had you reread lines 1 through 12 of the poem for these questions. So the first two questions are asking you about time of day and season, and I found my textual evidence to answer those questions pretty early on. So the first piece I have here is the first line of the poem, Once upon a midnight dreary. That tells me this is set at midnight, the dead of night. And for season, I looked at this line. Ah, distinctly I remember it was in the bleak December. So that tells you this was set during December, which is in the winter. So it's in the middle of the night and it's winter time, which gives you a really clear sense already of the setting of this poem. The last question is a little harder to answer, but I asked you what you thought the overall mood or atmosphere of this poem was. And I did pull out a couple phrases that stood out to me as setting that mood and atmosphere. The narrator says he's weak and weary, bleak December, and sorrow for lost Lenore. So what you should get from that is this sense that it's very cold and dark right now. That's kind of the atmosphere that you see here. You especially get that from this middle line, bleak December. Also, you get this feeling of sorrow and despair from the way that the speaker is feeling right now. For question 2, I had you look at a different stanza from The Raven, and I'll read this through as a reminder to you. But the raven still beguiling my sad fancy into smiling, straight I wheeled a cushioned seat in front of bird and bust and door. Then upon the velvet sinking, I betook myself to linking fancy unto fancy, thinking what this ominous bird of yore, what this grim, ungainly, ghastly, gaunt, and ominous bird of yore meant in croaking nevermore. So I asked you in this stanza what feeling or tone you would say it conveys. Now, actually, I would recommend jumping down to the second question here to help you answer the first question. So in the second question, I have you gather some textual evidence. I ask you to look at lines in the poem that help you decide what the feeling or tone is in this stanza. Something that I noticed is that a few of you were looking at the first line here, and I think you saw the word smiling and thought that this might actually be more of a happy tone. That is actually not the case. In reality, especially if you look at the last couple of lines here, you get a much more kind of heavy, almost sense of dread from this stanza. And the lines that I go to the most are these last couple here. So you've got this ominous bird of yore. Whoops. Ominous bird of yore. Ominous, if you don't know that word, means kind of something that you dread, something that is coming and you don't want it to. So ominous bird of yore. And also all of these adjectives down here are very, very descriptive. You've got grim and ungainly, ghastly, gaunt. These are all words that are saying something is really, really terrible. Those are not positive descriptive words. So if I go back up here, the feeling or tone that I get from this stanza is kind of this feeling of dread, for one. I get that from the word ominous. You also get a little tension building up from all of these very negative adjectives that are being used. And finally, I would say just a general feeling of despair. So very negative feelings attached to this stanza. The last question you had about the raven was question 3. I asked you first to gather some words and phrases that explain how the narrator or the speaker of this poem is feeling throughout the poem. And here are a couple that stood out to me. He describes his sorrow for lost Lenore, the love of his life. He mentions that he stood there wondering and fearing when he heard the knock on the door. He mentions having a melancholy burden, or a kind of depressing burden full of despair. And he says, leave my loneliness unbroken to the raven. So based on all of these things, you should get the sense that the narrator is feeling a lot of sorrow about Lenore. He is also suffering quite a bit because she's gone. Those are the big things I notice when I track his emotions throughout the poem. Now, this last question is hopping over to Wendigo, which is the other poem that we read. And I asked you to look at some imagery in this poem. So basically, what you're doing is you're reading through these passages and you're telling me which senses the passages are describing. Do you see, or do you have some things being described that you would see, some things that you'd hear, smell, or touch? So we'll start with this first passage. And the dog crept off, groaning, to the deepest part of the woods. In the hackles of dry brush, a thin laughter started up. Mother scolded the food warm and smooth in the pot and called you to eat. So a couple of things that stood out to me are the dog that is groaning, a thin laughter starting up in the bushes, and the mother calling the child to eat. Those are all things that you would hear. So for this one, I would say sound as the primary sense that that passage is appealing to. It's trying to get you to imagine hearing certain things. We'll move on to the second passage here. You saw me drag toward you. Oh, touch me, I murmured, and licked the soles of your feet. You dug your hands into my pale, melting fur. So I get two senses from this passage primarily. The first one would be sight. You saw me drag toward you. And the poem actually helps you out with that. They do use the words saw as well. I think you also get a sense of touch here, which actually is a word used in this line. But I also get this a lot from the last line here. You dug your hands into my pale, melting fur. So sight and touch are the primary senses you see in that passage. And here's the last passage. Steam rolled from my wintry arms. Each leaf shivered from the bushes we passed. Now, I kind of think you can interpret this a couple different ways, but it's kind of a unique way that it's appealing to your senses. It's almost a sense of feel, but specifically for heat heat versus coldness. You've got the steam rolling from my wintry arms line. You've got the leaves shivering. This kind of clear sense of being cold versus being warm in this last passage. So that is my interpretation of this analysis practice. But if you have any other questions about ways that you answered those questions, please let me know.